Do tongues still exist today? Part 2. Welcome to Truth Culture. Today we're continuing our conversation on speaking in tongues and whether or not spiritual gifts still happen in modern times. And with us is a friend of the show back, Glenn Rogers. Dr. Glenn Rogers, thank you for coming on the show again.
Sure, my pleasure.
And for those who are watching, and perhaps, it's been a week since the last video, but if you could remind our audience, what is the gift of speaking in tongues?
Okay. Last time, in the last video, we read from Acts chapter 2 and showed that in the Bible, when people spoke in tongues, what they were doing was speaking in human languages that they had not had the opportunity to learn. So if you were a Galilean fisherman, the languages you spoke would have been Aramaic and some Greek, probably. But you may be given the ability to speak in Latin or in Persian or in one of the Middle Eastern languages like Arabic or something like that. It's a human language that you had never had the opportunity to learn, but you could still speak it anyway.
Mm. Wow. Well, so this is a question that comes up, and I've been asked this several times, but referring to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 1, Paul speaks about the tongues of angels. Mm-hmm. And whenever I'm in a conversation with someone talking about the spiritual gift of tongues, this is always brought up. But what is Paul talking about referring to the tongues of angels?
Okay, that's an excellent question. And you have to keep in mind what Paul is trying to do overall in 1 Corinthians 13. His point in that entire chapter is that as important as the spiritual gifts are, from his point of view, right now in this first century, what's even more important is to be a person of love. Yeah. And he talks about faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love, and he's saying you've got to be a person of love, and that's more important than the spiritual gifts. And so to make that point, he engages in hyperbole, and he says, though I speak in the tongues of men and angels and have not love, I am nothing. He goes on and he's saying, if I give my body to be burned, but I'm not a loving person, it doesn't matter. He's using hyperbole. Yeah. Okay. Which is a form of exaggeration to make a point. He's saying, if I speak all of the languages there are, and of course, we know now that there are over 6,000 languages in the world. So he's saying, if I speak all 6,000 of those languages, plus the language that angels speak, and whatever, but I'm not a loving person, then it doesn't matter. Yeah. Now, the point is, when somebody engages in hyperbole to make a point, is what they say to be understood literally. Yeah. Okay. And the point is, no, it's not. Okay. Paul wasn't saying that there is a language that angels speak. Yeah. He was just saying, if I could speak all the human languages there were, and even angelic language, but if I'm not a loving person, then it doesn't matter. And someone says, well, how do you know that? How do you know that there's no such thing as an angelic language? Well, there are a couple of reasons. Okay. Number one is angels are not physical beings. They're not beings that have a physical body like we do. And when they communicate, they're not using a language the way we use languages. Language is a human device that we developed to facilitate getting ideas, for instance, from my head into your head, and we have to vocalize it and use words where we share a meaning, and you can understand what I mean, and I can understand what you mean, and that's human language, right? Yeah. Well, why would someone think that angels need that, since they're a different kind of being? And there's a text in Romans chapter 8 that I think is very important in this regard. Paul is talking about the Spirit lives in us, and we have all sorts of blessings. And he said, sometimes you don't even know how you ought to pray or what you ought to pray for. He's saying, but that's okay, because the Holy Spirit is in you, and he goes to God on your behalf with groanings that cannot be uttered. Yeah. All right, well, what does that mean? Well, it means when the Spirit is communicating with God, that they don't use a language. It's more what I would call an emotive telepathy. In other words, they're communicating at a higher level where they don't need a lexical kind of language where this word means this and this word means that. It's a different kind of communication. Well, that's the way angels would communicate. That's the way God would communicate with angels, the same as he's communicating with the Spirit. Okay? God is not a physical being. He doesn't have a body. He doesn't have vocal cords. He doesn't have a mouth, tongue, lips, and he doesn't need to use a physical language to communicate. So Paul is just not talking about the fact that there is an actual, literal, angelic language. And of course, people who think that there is such a thing and that they're speaking it when they're speaking in tongues, that's called glossolalia, and what most people hear is just what we would refer to as some kind of gibberish, and it doesn't make any sense to anybody. And that's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14, if you have the gift of languages, which was the legitimate human languages, then he says make sure there's an interpreter there so that it can be interpreted so that the people present can understand what's being said. Otherwise, nobody benefits from that because nobody understands what's being said.
Yeah, well, in the term, in John, we talk about the logos, that logos doesn't just mean spoken language. It can also refer to conscious thought as well. Is that?
Well, the word logos doesn't refer to language at all. It means the expression of rational thought as it's carried out. In other words, God has the thought, I'm going to create the universe.
Gotcha.
And the Word accomplishes that and creates the universe. He is the expression of the rational thought.
Yeah.
But that doesn't require a human language.
No, I understand. So essentially, just for our viewers, you're saying that angels don't need a vocal box like we have physically.
Right.
So the concept of forming syllables and all that stuff, that's not really relevant in the spiritual realm.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, when they appear to a human, to talk to a human, then it looks to that human like they're speaking like we do. They look evidently like us and they speak like us. God and two angels came to visit Abraham.
Yeah.
And he looked like another guy. And they were speaking and talking. But those theophanies, they're called, were in order to facilitate communication, which otherwise would have not been possible. When God communicated with Moses through the burning bush, Exodus 3, okay, how did those thoughts get into Moses' head from the flames of that bush that was on fire? Well, it was obviously some form of telepathy to where the thoughts appeared in his head or formed in his head so he could understand what was going on. Yeah. And he was speaking physically, what's your name? I don't want to go.
Yeah.
But God, the bush that was on fire wasn't speaking to him. It was a form of telepathy.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, and I just wanted to clarify that because you're talking about spiritual transformation of information.
Right.
It doesn't need the sounds that we make. And
right.
So, excellent point. So we touched on this a little bit last week, but we didn't go full into it. But why were there so many spiritual gifts in the first century?
Okay, that's an excellent question, and I think that's really something we need to spend some time thinking about. When Christianity outside of Palestine, when it began to be preached about 10 years after the ascension and the church was established there in Jerusalem, it was about 10 years before it was taken out into the Hellenistic world. And when it got out there, it was often Paul and Barnabas or Paul and Silas and some other people who stopped at a city and stayed there for a few days, a couple weeks, maybe a few months, and then moved on. And this was a very different kind of religion than what they were used to. And because they weren't Jewish, they didn't have all the background of the Jewish scriptures and understanding and everything. So they were left on their own, and they would have kind of floundered. And so God came up with a way to give them some gifts to help them function in a situation where otherwise they would have been completely alone. I mean, it's like you see movies and you read stories and whatever about a group of children who find themselves suddenly all alone on a desert island or up in the mountains or something. And how are they going to get by? What kind of skills are they going to have? And it's very dangerous for them because they don't have the skills necessary to survive and to get by. So the new Christians needed help. And so God designed a plan where an apostle could lay his hands on these people in a ceremonial kind of way, lay his hands on these people and ask the Spirit to give them a gift. The Spirit then gets to decide what gifts they have. And there's a whole bunch of them listed there. The gift of languages is one. The gift of interpretation of languages is another. The gift of teaching is another. Leadership. There were all kinds of gifts. Healing and various kinds of miracles. We're not even sure what exactly those were. Various kinds of miracles. In other words, they could do all sorts of things. Okay? So these gifts enabled them to function as mature Christians, although they weren't mature Christians. They were just new Christians. They were baby Christians. But they got these special gifts that allowed them to function as if they'd had 30, 40, 50 years to learn how to do these things.
Yeah.
And so there had to be a wide range of gifts available from the Spirit that he could say, okay, you get this one, you get this one, you get this one, and this one, and you get this one, and you get that one, and he gave different gifts so that people could function as a mature Christian, even though they weren't.
Yeah, well, that's excellent. We know you made the comparison of people who are stranded on an island. There's been several times even in the Old Testament of when spiritual, supernatural things occurred for a period of time, and then they ceased. And I was thinking when the children of Israel were in the wilderness with Moses, God miraculously provided them food, manna, but that wasn't indefinitely; it was for a period of time, and then it ceased. And so this has happened before in the Old Testament writings. It's not something new that's never happened. Maybe the distribution of the message and the method is different, but there has been other examples of the supernatural becoming commonplace and then ceasing.
And that's an excellent example. I'm glad you brought that up. It's an excellent example. And in fact, they had to be prepared for the fact that, okay, guys, tomorrow when you go out, there's not going to be any manna.
Yep.
Okay, you got to take care of your own food now. So you grow your own, you hunt, you do whatever because there's not going to be more manna. So you do this yourself.
You got to do it the natural way now.
Yeah. And that's an excellent example. That's very good.
Yeah. Well, it just occurred to me when you brought up the people stranded on the island. I was like, hey, you know what?
Yeah.
Moses.
Yeah.
So, final question. I wrote this one down because I want to make sure I get it right. But it says, so we still use ministry and evangelism today. Okay. Are those spiritual gifts, including the gift of tongues, still available today? In other words, in those lists, you also see evangelism as a gift and all that, and speaking in tongues. So are those gifts just gone completely, or are they still used somehow today?
Okay, that's an excellent question, and I'm going to read a text here in a minute. But let me set this up, because last time we talked about the fact, and we referenced Acts chapter 8, when Philip, one of the original deacons from Acts chapter 6, went down to Samaria and preached to the people there, and he was able to work miracles because the apostles had laid their hands on him. And many of the Samaritans became believers. But he didn't have the ability to lay hands on someone and ask that the Spirit give them the ability to work miracles. And so that's why he sent word to Jerusalem, and Peter and John had to go down to Samaria so they could lay hands on the Samaritan believers, and then the Spirit would empower them to work miracles. And then when Philip left and Peter and John left, you got a church in Samaria that has capable people who can do the things that need to be done. Now, we know that's the way this whole thing worked, because that's what we read in Acts chapter 8. If Philip could have imparted to them the ability to work miracles, then there would have been no need for Peter and John to travel all the way down to Samaria just to ceremonially lay their hands on people and ask the Spirit to give them a gift.
Yeah.
See, that would have been unnecessary. But it was necessary because Philip couldn't do that. He could work miracles, but he couldn't pass on the ability to work miracles. Only an apostle could do that. And so that's why you have Paul telling Timothy, remember when the apostles laid their hands on you and imparted to you a gift, and he's saying, use the gift, and whatever. And it pops up here and there through the New Testament, and that's important to remember. But then there's this text in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 that we referenced earlier, where Paul is saying the most important gift is love, faith, hope, and love, and of those three, the greatest is love. But he talks about the fact that this ministry, which was how I describe as a co-ministry between the apostles and the Holy Spirit, the apostles would lay their hands on people and then ask the Spirit, give them a gift. And then the Spirit would decide which gift to give them. So it was the Holy Spirit on one side, the apostles on the other, and so it was like an apostolic / Holy Spirit co-ministry, okay? But Paul is saying, but this isn't going to last forever.
Yeah.
Just like the manna that you brought up. This isn't going to last forever. And so let's just read what he has to say. 1 Corinthians 13, beginning at verse 8. He says, love is that which will last forever. The miraculous gifts from the Holy Spirit, however, will come to an end. Teaching through the miraculous power of the Spirit will stop. The ability to speak miraculously in languages one has never learned will not last forever. Receiving miraculous knowledge from the Holy Spirit will come to an end. At this time in your spiritual knowledge and your ability to teach is incomplete because the Spirit does not give any one of you all the knowledge there is. But in the future, when the will of God has been completely revealed, the miraculous powers given by the Holy Spirit will no longer be needed. Think of it this way. When I was a child, my thoughts and actions were those of a child. I needed help with everything I did. But when I grew to maturity, I no longer thought and acted like a child. I no longer needed the help I needed when I was a child. At this time, your spiritual insight is unclear and unfocused, like looking into a mirror that is not clean and polished. The reflection you see is not clear. But in the future, you will be able to understand things as completely as God understands you. Miraculous spiritual gifts will not last forever. What will last is faith, hope, and love. And of these three, love is the most important.
Man.
Now, the way I have translated this, I tried to translate it in a way that made it clear what Paul is talking about, the complete and revelation of God's will. But some translations, the way it's worded, it's harder to understand. It says, when that which is perfect comes, then that which is imperfect will pass away. And so people assume that that means when Jesus comes again. The problem with that translation, or with that understanding of the text, is that if that is the case, Jesus is being referred to as that which. And they think it's Jesus because it uses the word perfect. Okay, so we have two problems here. Jesus is never, ever referred to as a that
Amen.
which. I mean, that's like calling him an it.
Yes.
Okay.
I get that.
He's not a that which. And the word perfect is a very poor translation of the Greek teleos. A better translation is complete or mature. Okay. And the word perfect is still used in some senses because of its Old English usage, where they meant complete. Okay. You are a complete person. They would say, you are a perfect man. Well, they didn't mean sinless, perfection, like Jesus. They meant complete,
Yeah.
fully well-rounded. Okay. So what Paul is describing here in this text is, and he says very clearly, there's coming a time when the special miraculous gift ministry of the Holy Spirit will end. Okay. No question about that. Mm-hmm. Okay. The question is when.
Yeah.
All right. And some people are saying, well, at the end of time when Jesus comes again. Well, but it can't be referring to that, because that would mean Jesus is a that which, and it ignores the meaning of the word teleos, which is complete, not the word perfect.
Yeah.
And Jesus is never described as complete. Okay, it's just not. All right. It's talking about when God's will is fully revealed and people have time to read, to learn, to think, to grow, then they won't need the help of the spiritual gifts. Those were to help new Christians, baby Christians, who could not possibly survive on their own.
Yeah.
But by the end of the first century, when the last apostle died, the full revelation from God has been given, and people can have it, read it, understand it. Now, that doesn't mean they had the Bible at the end of the first century.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, but the letters, let's say Paul's letters, James' letter, Peter's letter, whatever, almost immediately after those were written, people began to copy them and pass them around. And so there were copies or collections of copies that existed very early in the first century. And people could read those and understand. They had time to learn and grow and think, just like you and I have had in our lives, and they would not need the special gifts of the Holy Spirit. Plus, as we read from Acts 8, only an apostle could pass on the gift by laying his hands on you. By the time the last apostle died, there's nobody left to lay hands on, so there's no way to transmit the gift. And so all of this stuff ended with the death of John in the first century, which was about 100.
Excellent. Well, and then also in that text that you just read, it talked about the three that would cease. I think it's tongues, prophecy, and the gift of knowledge, right?
In that place, those are the illustrative ones.
But from talking to you in our last show, all three of those are tied to establishing the ministry of the gospel and the revelation of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, outreach.
Outreach. And so once the clarity of what that is established, there's no need for those to continue, essentially.
Right.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, Glenn. Well, we're going to have to stop here, but this is the end of part 2. But I've received some questions from our first episode, so we're going to do a part 3.
Okay.
But it's going to be more of a Q&A. We're going to put you under a spotlight and see if you can answer some questions that people have been asking concerning this topic.
I'll give it my best shot.
Well, thank you. Until next time, God bless. And if you have any comments or you want to leave a message, please comment below, or you can email us at info@ripplelight.com. We'd love to hear from you. God bless.